Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Sam Spieler and Iad Darris.
Hey,
Hello.
Good evening. Today we are reviewing As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner, the last book in our series Bad Adaptation, Good Books Made into Bad Films. If this is your first time joining us, we are also a literary book club on Reddit. You can find our discussion there by clicking on the link in the episode description. If you'd like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That is also in our episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will be having an in-depth discussion of this book. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well. So, Sam, this was your pick for our series. Do you want to talk about this little-known author, William Faulkner? Billy F. This is now officially our oldest book that we've read for this series.
Yeah, this was published in 1930, almost a good decade before Pale Horse, Pale Rider. William Faulkner was born in the end of the 1800s. We know him as pretty famous today, but he was not that way at the beginning of his career. He was not really recognized for his writing for quite a while. He got by financially between his other jobs and his writing for a number of years, but a couple of years after publishing As I Lay Dying, he began working in Hollywood as a screenplay writer. And between the years 1932 and 1954, he worked on 50 different films. Something I found kind of interesting, sort of like our friend John Williams, the author of Stoner. It took the attention of European writers like Sartre and Camus to rediscover him in the 40s. And a collection of his earlier work, republished in 1944, helped to bolster his cred here in the US. He ended up winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949, followed by 2 Pulitzers and 2 National Book Awards.
I think something else that's kind of notable in kind of an Inception sort of way is that we're talking about an adaptation of Faulkner, and Faulkner himself, as a screenwriter, worked on multiple adaptations.
Yeah, one of which was an adaptation of Hemingway's work. He worked on To Have and Have Not. And also, the most famous film that he worked on was The Big Sleep.
So perhaps he would not look down on Mr. Franco very much for his efforts.
Well, then again, doesn't every serious writer look down on Franco?
Certainly now. I chose this book because I had a short list of things I was considering for this series, but other than a few short stories, Faulkner has always been a blind spot for me. I've never read any of his novels, and I wanted to fix that. And also, a film adaptation of something experimental like this sounded interesting or potentially hot trash.
Yes, and how did this one turn out, Sam?
Your mileage may vary. I think I might have disliked this more than the two of you, but we'll see. So, as I said, this was published in 1930. It's a Southern Gothic story about a very unhappy family. It's the first of his novels set in the fictional Yoknapatawpha County, I think that's how you say it, in Mississippi, which is based on his Lafayette County. And it's split between 15 different narrators, with a couple of them, specifically Darl, standing out as primary narrators. Though I would not call him a protagonist per se. That's a little too strong of a word. Addie Bundren, the mother of 5 children, in order: Cash, Darl, Jewel, Dewey Dell, who is the only girl, and Vardaman, who is much more of a child compared to the others. Addie is on her deathbed and soon after dies, but wants to be buried in her hometown, Jefferson, which is normally a day's journey away by wagon. Her husband, Ance, is determined to follow her wishes, but he is stubborn, lazy, manipulative, and a lot of other negative attributes. And his dogmatic desire to follow through, against harsh summer conditions, allows for a host of misfortunes to fall on the family as they try to make their way to the burial site. Complicating this is the intense hatred his children have for him and each other for reasons that become sort of clear as the story unfolds. The book features a lot of early use of stream of consciousness and other experimentation in form.
Do they hate him and each other?
That's what I was going to say.
I think they detest him. Yeah, it's a little simple to say they hate each other. I think there is some detesting going on, not between some of them. Like, I think Cash and Darl are fairly close as this family can be.
I think the fairest thing to say is that Jewel hates everybody.
Jewel hates everyone
Yes.
for sure. Dewey Dell, I think, has a very complicated relationship to everyone, especially Darl.
I think Cash likes everyone. Cash is like the responsible older brother, and he sacrifices himself constantly. And Vardaman is just too young. I think he likes everyone. And I don't even know if they all hate their dad. I think there are varying levels of disdain and dislike.
Disdain is a good word for it. So, because this book was written over 90 years ago, I think we're probably safe to give spoilers. James, you were saying that the people listening to this are probably writing book reports, so we can help them out.
Yeah, if you're doing that high school paper on Faulkner like I did, continue to listen. What if there's like 110-year-old woman, and she's got a list of books and she's going in order and she finally got to Faulkner and she's like, oh, God damn it.
The extremely aged are a key demographic.
All right, let's do some homework for people.
This book is, I think, deliberately difficult at times to parse, but it has some of the most beautiful imagery I've read in the past year or longer. For example, the sun, an hour above the horizon, is poised like a bloody egg upon a crest of thunderheads. The light has turned copper, in the eye portentous, in the nose sulphurous, smelling of lightning. There was another one that I really liked. So this passage, that one I think was from Darl. Darl gives most of the really beautiful passages, but this one is from Dewey Dell. In this passage, she runs away from her family. I think this is right after Addie passes away. So she runs toward the barn. The cow in silhouette against the door nuzzles at the silhouette of the bucket, moaning. Then I pass the stall. I have almost passed it. I listen to it saying for a long time before it can say the word, and the listening part is afraid that there may not be time to say it. I feel my body, my bones and flesh beginning to part and open upon the alone. And the process of coming unalone is terrible. Leif, 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 Leif. I lean a little forward, one foot advanced with dead walking. I feel the darkness rushing past my breast, past the cow. I begin to rush upon the darkness, but the cow stops me, and the darkness rushes on upon the sweet blast of her moaning breath, filled with wood and with silence. I loved this passage because this is right after her mom dies, but it's mixed with this kind of sexual imagery of the hot breath of this cow and her thinking about this man. We don't know who Leif is at this point, other than I think by this point we know that they had some kind of sexual thing, but we don't know much more than that.
He was a neighborhood stud.
I think this was pretty early before you find out that she's pregnant.
Yeah, there are hints before this, but we don't actually know that she's pregnant until after this.
Yeah, I agree with you in that there are some really nice images here. And a key point that you mentioned before is this is told from multiple points of view. And what I really liked about this book is Darl, the character responsible for most of the narration in the book. There's this tension between his interior monologue or his narration and his actual spoken dialogue, which is really interesting because he comes off like everyone else, not especially educated, but the narration or the interior monologue is actually very educated. And it's interesting because the book kind of shows him as someone who has a preternatural understanding of everyone's plight. And that kind of tension is not something that you can, as a reader, easily resolve. You kind of have to wool around and wrestle with this idea of a character who has either some kind of magical ability to know more about everyone else, or it's kind of like Faulkner winking at you a little bit by having this play with a narrator who is a stand-in for the writer or the third person omniscient. I think we'll talk about it in more detail next episode, but I just wanted to point out that that's something in the book that I found really intellectually interesting.
I think it's unresolved on purpose. I think the fact that everyone else is quite limited in perspective, but he seems almost clairvoyant, it adds to the gothic element of the story. Because this is a world that not everybody can see through, but it's very transparent for him. Like he can see very clearly what's wrong with Dewey Dell, and he can see very clearly into Jules' past, even though there's no real reason for him to be able to.
Even though it is unresolved, we do get this kind of odd passage. I believe it's Darrell's last passage as a narrator. We get a bunch of information that we did not get before as his mental state is kind of breaking down. We find out that he fought in World War I, which probably explains a lot of the issues he has and the reason why people in the community seem to think that he's strange. That is a possible reason.
When I started this book, obviously it's very difficult to read. And I think it continues to be difficult to read, but as you get a sense of who the characters are and their relationships to each other and what they're struggling with, it gets easier. For me, that happened around 40, 50 pages in. And it's also around that time that, I start getting an idea of what the book is about. And that's when I started feeling like, okay, it's not just a good book. It's actually a great work of literature with the capital L that, I said Donna Tartt's book that we just read, I said it wasn't. I mean, for me, it's obvious that this is. It takes on a lot of these big questions and big ideas, and it doesn't answer them, but it poses these questions and lets you think about them.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I feel like it's a very strong novel. Where you said that you felt it was difficult because you didn't understand the characters, for me, that wasn't a problem. The problem I found was his diction. He uses a lot of very specific diction. Sometimes it's invented by himself, and sometimes it's just rural diction from, the last century. And it's a real chore, I think, to really have to struggle so hard with the diction. But in terms of the form, I really enjoyed that. I felt like the novel was kind of pushing me out with the diction and then pulling me back in with the form and the kind of absurd humor that we find in the story. So when I would read, oftentimes when I would encounter a lot of stuff that was just really unclear, I would begin skimming. But then I'd come across one of those images, like Sam mentioned earlier, and I'd stop myself and I'd say, whoa, I can't read so quickly. I have to pay more attention. So it's just like driving in a car where you're constantly trying to speed up, but you constantly have to slow down, which was a difficult reading experience, but still a rewarding one. I think it's two things at once. When you read it and you're like, "Oh, this is a 90-year-old novel. What the fuck does puzzle gutted mean?" That was when I was frustrated with it, but it's actually in terms of its sensibility, it's actually a very modern sensibility, especially through the form. There's a pair of sections early on where Cash is talking about how he built the coffin. And it's delivered in a series of thoughts, 13 thoughts about why he built it with a bevel. And that to me was when I knew that this was really a novel kind of at odds with itself, or a novel that was one thing but secretly another thing. And then the second section is the section from Vardaman, where it's just one sentence: "My mother is a fish." That's the sort of thing that makes you scratch your head in a way that earns it that capital L literature, because it's very clearly something that you can't grasp easily, but very clearly something full of meaning and full of something that compels you to read and investigate more.
Before we take a break, I'll add one more thing. We've talked about, what makes this book great or a work of literature. the points of view, the what else do we say? The imagery, the the fact that it's many different things. For me, what makes a masterful writing is that Faulkner gives you a lot of space. I mean, formally, he does it with all the chapter breaks and that one chapter, with just a sentence. Formally, he gives you a lot of space, but also thematically, he gives you a lot of space. Like he would present something and then he would just skip to something else and then he would return back to it. And that kind of in betweenness, the relief, gives you space to kind of think about it and gives him space to juxtapose whatever he just showed you with something else or whatever he wants you to think about with something else. Like that's what's really interesting to me, the way he kind of almost paces these different ideas throughout the book. And it's not something that, you can chart or anything, but just the experience of reading the book is that you don't feel that he's lecturing you because he's giving you so much space to draw your own conclusions and to see how different ideas relate or how different ideas relate with feelings that you might have about grief or loss. For me, that's what makes it really great as a read because even though it is formal experimentation, it is more than that. It's not just formal experimentation. Like that's something I had an issue with other books that we've read in the past where it was primarily formal experimentation. In this book, it's just more. It's that, but it's also an exploration of the human condition, of life and ideas. And it's not a simple exploration. It explores a lot of different ways a person can think about death or how one deals with loss, what is precious to a person. Like, in the book every person loses something right by the end of the book. So for me, that's what makes this book really good. It's not just formal experimentation, it's like more than that.
Well, and it's so hard to pin down what this book is about other than just the plot, too. It is this exploration of grief and different ways of reacting to it. But there's considerations about all these different themes, but I don't know if I would say it is any one of those things. And I know we're going to get into this a lot next episode, but like morality is a big issue in this book, but I don't really know what it's saying about morality. He toys with his ideas quite a bit. And like you said, he gives a lot of space for that play and for you to think about it.
I think what you can call it is world building, not in the sense that science fiction writers would talk about world building, but rather maybe psychological world building. He's built a series of characters, and they seem to inhabit the same worlds, but each of the characters has a unique perspective inside of that world. It's very much of a piece with itself, but each piece inside of it is also unique and distinct. And it's difficult to understand each piece because it often seems to conflict with the rest of the world that it lives in. But that confusing and conflicting nature, I think, is the same way that we're confused and conflicted in life itself. I think that's probably the biggest achievement that Faulkner has in this novel is that he shows us the way that life itself is a struggle, but not in a didactic or thematic way, but in a very representational way. He's representing life without representing it in the traditional novelistic way.
All right, I think we are due for a break. When we come back, we'll move from Faulkner to Franco, two geniuses. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So, Sam, James Franco, adapted this book into a film in 2013. Would you like to tell us about this film?
Oh boy, would I. I think I was in some ways overly harsh in my viewing, but in others, not really. While I was watching it, I kept listing things that I was finding problematic. And I noticed that with the other two books that we read and movies that we watched, even though they had their problems, I was paying attention the whole time. This one, I kind of phased in and out. And I think because the story was so clear,
You mean the story in the novel, or
I should say the plot of the novel was so clear to me. I knew that it was going to be fairly straightforward, and the only difference would be how it was shot and portrayed. And because I was annoyed with the movie, I just found my attention waning at different parts. So there are things that immediately were problematic to me, and maybe you guys don't feel the same. But Franco uses a lot of split screen and shaky cam. And where I kind of understand what he's going for, I felt they were poor substitutions for what could have been more meaningful cinematography and fixed shots. His solution to the internal monologues in the book are characters occasionally staring straight at the camera to deliver their meaningful lines. That I felt was very weird, and I understand again why he is trying for that, but why not just have that as a normal voiceover? We don't have to see their lips move. We really don't have to see them staring straight at the audience. The acting it depends on the actor. There is some good acting in it. I would say Franco is maybe the worst, and he tries the least for an accent out of all the others. And the need for the characters to enunciate the lines because they're speaking in this country diction and also trying for accents, I felt that it kind of robbed the weight of some of the words. But I tried not to hold that too much against them because this is a difficult novel. It would have been a difficult screenplay.
Before we start talking about, Franco and his failings, I think it's worth saying, first of all, that this is a difficult thing to do. And the movie fails, but it fails in at least two different ways. It fails because he's trying to do something really difficult. And it also probably fails because he's just not really a good filmmaker. And it's probably not really important to consider why he is a bad filmmaker. I think that that's kind of evident just in some of the bad choices that he made. But in terms of the way he's adapted this novel, the way he's chosen to tackle some of the challenges, I think it's okay.
yeah, I agree with you. I also think it's okay. My process of viewing it was maybe different from you two. I read the book in about thirds, three or four different sessions. And after I read those sessions, I watched that session, that chunk of the film. So for me, I did it differently just because of the way my schedule was. Like I could read when I commute to work and then I could watch in the evenings. So that's how I matched up. So I viewed it as almost a companion piece. It kind of worked. Like a lot of things that were not clear in the book became clear in the movie. And I think you could make an argument that maybe it shouldn't be clear. Like, for example, certain relationships should not be as clear because Faulkner made it less clear, maybe on purpose. But I found myself appreciating it as a companion piece. For me, the biggest issue is that in the last two books, I actually thought both of them could be adapted. With High Rise and Goldfinch, I thought, they could be adapted to the screen. This book, I don't think can be adapted to the screen. I just think the way it's a work of formal experimentation does not lend itself to an adaptation.
I think more than the other two books as well, the prose here really goes a long way. And even if you were to do away with the other important things like the experimentation and the purposeful complications in understanding, you're missing out on some really great imagery.
But, a novel is always going to exceed a film in terms of imagery. So I don't think if you're trying for an adaptation, you should even worry about that. I think in the last episode, James, you had talked about whether or not a film can do enough to justify its existence, or whether a film can do enough of what a novel can do. And I think that's fair because you can't get the imagery, but no film could. So either you say no films should adapt novels, or you don't consider that at all, right?
Sure, but to James's point, like the other two books, High Rise is about some ideas, but the prose isn't so good that you're missing out on too much. It could be made into a decent movie. It wasn't, but it could be. And the same with Tart's book, The Goldfinch. That book is all story. There's some okay prose, but you really don't need it. That's not what's important to that book. Here, I feel like it is immensely important. I understand your point, though.
I'll try to defend Franco a little bit here. When I was reading the book, the first section of it, I thought to myself, how would I adapt this? And actually, I thought, okay, split screen is the way to go.
Why? Out of
Okay,
curiosity, why?
because what he does is he has multiple chapters that cover the same ground. He will have two characters discussing the same event that happened. So I think if you're trying to stay true to this kind of formal experimentation, the closest you can get is split screen. The problem is he doesn't actually do that. He doesn't use split screen as a way of portraying the same event from two points of view.
Correct.
He uses split screen in a different way where one side of the screen would show a person just contemplating or standing, and the other screen would be where your focus is, and that character might be speaking. So you will get a close focus shot of a character speaking, and then the other one is like a further away shot, right, of that character seen from maybe a distance by another character. It doesn't quite get the same effect. I think he's trying to do it, but he didn't nail it. What he's trying to do is really hard, but I wouldn't have done it that way. I would have still used split screen, but I wouldn't show a still photo. Or, I mean, it's not still, but it might as well be, because in that one side of the split screen, the character actually isn't doing anything.
It's also not clear in the split screen that the two images are from two perspectives. Like, we don't know who the second perspective belongs to. And also, the camera positions us in the world of the story in a way that's not tied to any person. So there's no interiority possible. We only get the fact that there are two perspectives, which is part of the effect, but not really the whole thing.
And what you said earlier, once again, this is me trying to defend Franco. What you said earlier about how, there are monologues and the characters speak into the camera, I think that's his attempt at producing just prose.
Oh, yeah.
Like he is trying to give you just the beautiful prose. I think for me, it's okay. Like it is off putting in a way that the book is off putting, not in a bad way. I think the problem is that he uses it too much. In the book, it doesn't happen all the time, but he uses it all the time. Like certain sections of it should be done that way. Like my mother is a fish. That definitely should be done that way. But there are certain other sections where I just thought, I mean, this could have been done in scene. You didn't really need to just have a monologue.
I think that Vardaman line might be the first time he uses it, or at least the first really stark use. And that was totally fine with me. And then it just keeps happening. And I think that cheapens it. But it also just, the more it goes on, the more it feels really self aware and self important. And I don't think this is a self aware, well, it is sort of a self aware book. I don't think it's self important, though.
I think I disagree. I think that it perhaps could have been used even more than it was, because I think the problem that I have with it is it conflicts and it clashes strongly with the rest of the film, where the characters are more or less playing it straight. Like they have the story and they are on screen as people in a world, as, kind of a natural way of portraying it. And I think what would have been really interesting is to see As I Lay Dying directed by somebody like Jean-Luc Godard, who would be really much more experimental and much more formally adventurous than Franco is. Franco dips his toes in the water, but I'd really like him to just jump in.
So if they had more like Shakespearean monologues, soliloquies.
I don't know if it necessarily needs to be delivered in the same way that it is, but you have to decide, I think, when you're making a film or writing a screenplay, is this people in a world and just the camera happens to be there, or is this cinema?
Yeah. Um, I will also defend not necessarily Franco, but I will say that he's portraying Darl, and he, I think, has the toughest job of all the actors because Darl has this very complicated character. In the book, it's made very clear that everyone sees Darl, except maybe Cash and his little brother Vardaman, that everyone sees Darl as strange or crazy, and that becomes clearer over time. But right from the beginning, I don't remember if his own mom calls him this, or certainly the neighbors call him queer. That is hard to come across in a movie, that you have this strange character, but also, fairly intelligent.
The neighbor definitely does call him queer, but for me, that is not very clear that he is this strange character because the book is so strange that when I was reading the book, I didn't think he really stood out as someone who was especially strange. For me, it was more of a vague magical quality. I read somewhere, maybe it was on Wikipedia, maybe it was some commentary on the book, that described his character as a descent into madness, which I didn't see at all in the book. I didn't see it as a descent. I just saw him as being a strange character all the way through. The movie, for me, was really unclear on the character of Darl. And that's, in my opinion, the weakest part of the movie is that Franco should have found someone else to portray Darl. Like he just didn't land the performance. The character was just kind of vague throughout. And I might be speaking for you guys, but I didn't find myself connected to him at all.
I think that's the case with most of the performances. The only performances that really stood out to me are the actress who plays Addie and the guy who plays Jewel. I think those two performances were quite well done, but the others were quite flat.
Oh, I like the father quite a bit. And the kid, it's hard to say. I mean, it's a child actor. So I thought the kid was fine. Maybe I'm just a little bit too easy on child actors, but every time I see a movie with a child actor, I just think, oh, all right, they're fine. Yeah, and I thought Cash was okay. Like in the film, he seemed to have a smaller role than the book. Like that was my feeling of it, but I thought he was okay.
Yeah, I think Cash is the most straight character. So it's easier to play Cash on screen, I think, because it's easier to understand Cash.
The character Ants seemed suitably disheveled for me, and also his the actor's gaping maw was exactly what I envisioned while I was reading the book. Like I thought, that sort of grotesque, toothless hangdog look that he has. I thought that was fairly accurate for what I expected, at least. Is it Tim Blake Nelson?
Yeah.
Yes, that's it.
I guess for me, when I'm talking about his performance not being very good, it's just that he gets so much mileage out of the way he looks, which is good. I mean, he looks the way I think the character should, but the way he acts is something else. Like, I don't give him so much credit for the way he looks. I think there's one more thing that we should talk about is if we're evaluating this film, whether or not it's good or not, I think we have to decide, are we evaluating it as a standalone work, as a thing that people would watch alongside As I Lay Dying, or in James's case, is this actually a companion piece that you would experience at the same time as the novel? Because I think there are kind of three different yardsticks that you would measure the film against.
I don't think it should be watched. It's not the worst movie in the world, but unless you really are against the idea of reading Faulkner, just read the book. It's not that long. And I know it would be difficult for some people, but I don't really see the point in watching the movie. Like, it's not good enough to represent Faulkner, I don't think.
I kind of disagree. I think as a standalone work, it does hit on some of the main ideas of the book, like loss, and it doesn't do a good job with it, but it does, for me, an adequate enough job where if you just want to get the gist of the novel, you can, watch this and get the gist of the novel without the formal experimentation. I mean, I think you get that it's weird, but I don't think you really get the impact of the formal experimentation.
I do think you get some of the humor in the movie, interestingly enough.
I think it's kind of like last week when we're talking about the goldfinch. Like, you can watch this movie after reading the novel and get something out of it, but if you only watch this film, there are so many gaps there that you don't really understand the significances of the thing that you're seeing. So you really kind of want to read the book first and then watch this. I don't think that this is a movie that can stand on its own.
I think this encompasses more of the plot than the Goldfinch did. But at least with the Goldfinch, even though you're missing significant things, shortening it to a 2-hour movie or whatever that was, you're not losing out so much. You're still getting most of the major points. I think here you're losing out on so much of Faulkner that I don't know that there's a point. Like, who is this movie for?
I don't think the film actually misses all that much from the story of the book.
But again, who is this movie actually for? Is it for people who don't want to read? I mean, if that's true, then okay. But that's really the only audience I can think of that might care about it.
This might be a question for our series wrap, but who watches adaptations?
Well, there are some good ones out there. I'm sure we'll talk about that.
I mean, if you take a popular adaptation, not, an obscure one, but a popular one, I think the audience will probably be people who are fans of the book. So, as a standalone work, I don't know. I mean, I probably wouldn't recommend it. I don't know if it actually works as a standalone especially well. What's interesting though is I read probably 8 or 9 film reviews from the most reputable critics I could find. And what was clear to me that the people who actually gave a positive review were people who read the book. The people who actually totally panned the film, to me, it seemed like they did not read the novel.
That surprises me.
Well,
That
I'm,
is the
I'm
opposite
going
of what
off
I
of
would expect.
memory. Yeah, I'm going off of memory. I think the Post and the Times and the Guardian all had positive reviews, and they all, in their own way, said that this book is impossible to adapt, but if you were to adapt it, Franco comes close, which is kind of how I felt, before I read these reviews. I'm like, yeah,
That's true, but it's a big if because you obviously don't have to do it.
I mean, that's the problem here, right? Like, this is a huge vanity project. He comes off as I don't know if smug is the word, but definitely kind of entitled. So I'm guessing that none of us would recommend the film. I'm also guessing that all of us would recommend the book.
Does the novel need to be recommended? I mean, at this point, if we're talking about a canon, this is as canon as it gets, right?
I do wonder. It was canon when I was in high school. That was what, 20 years ago. I actually wonder if kids in high school are still reading Faulkner. Did you read Faulkner in high school? My high school was special. I had like elective courses. I took a course on modernist fiction in which I read Faulkner.
No, I got to him in college.
I think all I read was A Rose for Emily in high school.
So this is why I wonder, like, this book is getting old enough where it doesn't necessarily get added to courses. So I wonder, do you think it should be taught? Maybe not this book, but Faulkner. Should Faulkner still be taught? in college, let's say?
In college, absolutely. In high school, I think it's harder because high school is considered general purpose education, and it's difficult to find teachers who could teach Faulkner adequately because it is capital L literature and it's hard to read and it's hard to teach. Like, you have to actually have some serious thought put into your interpretation before you can say much about Faulkner, I would say.
Right. If you have space for, let's say, two modernists or two modernist works, I think
Yeah, you'd go Hemingway.
Fitzgerald is probably easier to
Oh, yeah.
teach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
Fitzgerald.
Hemingway too. Those are both a lot easier to teach and teach well.
If the current generation doesn't read Faulkner in school, they're definitely not going to teach him in the next generation when they become English teachers. So he may be on the way out.
Which is where Mr. Franco steps in and introduces Faulkner to a new generation.
I don't know that that movie's going to turn anyone on to Faulkner, though.
I've read this book and The Sound and the Fury, and The Sound and the Fury for me was like one of my favorite works of literature that I had to read for class. That was a long time ago. So it's hard to say which one I think I enjoyed more. At this point, I might still say The Sound and the Fury because I've read that twice, but it's very close. Yeah, you've read this and Absalom, Absalom.
I also read Sound and the Fury, but both of these are quite a while ago. I would say that this and The Sound and the Fury are probably tied with each other, but because I know this one much more now, because I just recently read it, I would go with this one. I think the thing is that, like I was saying about him being taught in high school, he is an author that you have to grow into. Like, I don't know if it's really fair to expect high schoolers to understand Faulkner because he's not for everybody and he requires more effort than a lot of other writers. Perhaps it's best to encounter Faulkner in your 30s rather than your teens or 20s.
Yeah, I think so. Because I found the ideas in this book more interesting for sure. But I found The Sound and the Fury, the ending of it, much more devastating. But this was once again 20 years ago because, spoiler alert, Sam, that book, I believe, has a suicide.
I thought you were going to say, spoiler alert, Sam, we're old.
All right, let's stop here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base with our review of this book and film, we'd love for you to let us know on Reddit. James Franco, if you're listening to us, you can join us on Reddit and tell us why we're wrong. You can find that link below. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. It would be pretty interesting if Franco actually popped up on our subreddit. I feel like that's the kind of thing he would do. And keep in mind, James, I defended your work. It's Sam who didn't like it and thought it was terrible. I thought it was all right. So, if you'd like to support us in your local bookstore, you can find our bookshop.org link, which is in our episode description as well. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can leave us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with an in-depth discussion of this book and film, As I Lay Dying. If you're interested in joining that discussion, go ahead and find a copy of this book. It is a hard read, but it is actually a pretty fast read because of all the chapter breaks. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.